Great, thank you, Ale. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Robert Cuffey. I'm with the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana. I don't live in Guyana. I live in Brooklyn, but that is not a condition unique to me because half of Guyana's population lives abroad. So we just listened to "Not a Blade of Grass," which is a folk song by Dave Martins and the Trade Winds in Guyana, and it's the most emblematic song I feel of understanding and describing Guyanese nationalism. And for a large part, Guyana as a country which has such a small population exists on the Atlantic coast, is separated from its South American neighbors due to language and its colonial history, and kind of exists in the world as a place you have to explain to people over and over. That song, in many ways, defines what it means to be Guyanese. And sadly, a large part of what it means to be Guyanese has been more and more becoming anti-Venezuelanism. This has, of course, reached a new peak due to the crisis in Venezuela that sent refugees throughout South America and the Caribbean and as far away as the US and Europe. But it's always been ingrained in a Guyanese society. So I can give you an example. When Guyana's drug war first broke out in the late 1990s, the police went after this one bandit that they referred to as Blackie. And at the time, I was living 2 villages away from Blackie, and the police bombarded a hotel to get this person out. Now, it was claimed that the police had such a disproportionate response because this bandit was supposedly working with elements of the government and had information against them. But not knowing any of this, as in 1999, God, I'm really bad at math. How old was I? Was about 14. Yeah. So actually, no, this didn't happen in 1999. It happened a little earlier. But the point is that living 2 villages away and hearing this bombardment, scared out of my mind, crawling into my bed with my mom, and the whole household just shivering and shuddering. We were like, what is going on? And the first thought that came to us was this: Venezuela is invading. And that to me is like being Guyanese and our relationship to Venezuela in a nutshell. But we, of course, exist in a wider capitalist world, right? So to understand our place in the world, we have to dig into our history. And it's very interesting to know that this country called Guyana, which gained independence in 1966, existed previous to that as a British colony. However, the British colony itself had a pretty short run because the Europeans who colonized the Atlantic coast in these 3 colonies of Berbice, Essequibo, and Demerara that would be merged together to form British Guyana were actually the Dutch. It was the Dutch who came in and built the colony. Of course, they built by administrating while having the African slaves do all the work by forcing the indigenous, what we call in Guyana, Amerindian population into the interior and away from the coast, using them as slave catchers to return runaway slaves. But part of the problem the Dutch faced was that they could not people the colony. So what they did was they reached out to other Europeans to come in as settlers. And the biggest response they got was from the British. So when the British and the Dutch fought wars in Europe, right, and their strength rose and fell, eventually in the early 19th century, the Dutch ceded what is now Guyana to the British, and the colony of British Guyana was established. And the colony faced a problem insofar as it developed, the capitalist world internationally was developing, and this mode of production of chattel slavery of African slaves, which existed in Guyana, meant that the production of sugar was facing competition from the mechanization of the world generally and of agriculture specifically, that they could not keep up with. So adding to this, we have things like the Haitian Revolution happening. In Guyana itself, we have slave revolutions happening, right? Like even before the British took control in 1763, in the colony of Berbice, we had the Berbice slave revolt, where this man named Cuffy, hint, hint, led a revolution that pretty much took control of the colony of Berbice. But for his prevarication, obfuscation, and just waiting too long, it could have been a successful revolution. But in 1763, what they did was actually wait for word from the British, from the Dutch. And as they awaited word, the Dutch dispatched a armed contingent, which eventually put down the revolution. But if you ever go to Guyana, there is a place called the Square of the Revolution with this huge, towering statue of Cuffy that represents that revolution that happened. So the British were hard pressed to keep up. It's but the soil on the coast of Guyana, and it's important to understand that the majority of Guyanese people live on the coast, and the rest of the country is, for the most part, a vast wilderness that's populated but not necessarily tamed. So the British faced the challenge of the decline of sugar on the international market based on the way that the labor saving technology that they did not have. In addition to that, as I said before, the slave rebellions that were happening, the abolition movement, and all these things. In addition to this, there was the border dispute with Venezuela, which was going on in the 19th century. So then the role of the United States becomes important, because then the United States, proclaims the Monroe Doctrine, which says that they have the right to decide these like territorial disputes that were happening. And the long and short of the dispute is, for the most part, that they said, we need to establish what the boundaries are. And a British commissioner named Schomburg, he's a surveyor and a naturalist, he went out to survey. And in 1835, his survey became known as the Schomburg Line, a boundary that claimed an additional 30,000 square miles for Guyana, extended within this county of Essequibo. So when Venezuela disputed this in 1841, eventually they agreed to arbitration through the United States. And that arbitration held up the British line, even though it's very clear that there was an extra 30,000 square miles. But as I said before, Guyana is a place where the coastline is where people live. The coastline was important because they had this rich, fertilized soil. If you go buy sugar now anywhere in the world, for example, you will see that one of the labels on your sugar may say Demerara sugar. And that's just for this type and style of sugar produced in the county of Demerara in Guyana. But if you look closely at the packaging for your Demerara sugar, you will see it was not actually produced neither in the county of Demerara nor within Guyana itself. So it's kind of like Guyana has this great legacy, right, when it comes to sugar. But because to this day, sugar workers go into the field with machetes or cutlasses, as we call them, to cut down the cane, and then they hoist the cane onto their shoulder and throw it in a waiting pontoon, which is then dragged down a canal to the factory. We can't compete with the mechanization of sugar in places like Australia, where the process is a lot less labor intensive. So in understanding Guyana's place in the world, then the general picture is that we are in what's called the periphery, right? Like we don't play a major role. One can say, for example, if there was a wizard who disappeared Guyana from the map today, what part of international relations would be changed? And part of it has to do with this. I would say that Guyana economy has never moved away from the concept of producing primary products for the international market. And this is very significant, not just for Guyana, but for understanding the development of neo-colonial nations. Because as we posit there being a first world and a third world or a global south, you know, there is in some sense a second world of countries that have been able to institute technological development, build an industrial working class, and push back against the dominant imperialist powers to carve out spaces and spheres of influence. Guyana has not been one of these nations, and to use one of Walter Rodney's phrases, it was underdeveloped and deliberately so, insofar as all of the infrastructural development in Guyana happened specifically along the coastline and specifically along where the plantations were. One great example is the issue of rail and trains in Guyana. Guyana had an active rail system, but it ran along the coast from plantation to plantation. And when the British demitted Guyana, it's a system that shut down because there was no way to keep it going. So Guyanese economists who were not socialists or Marxists will tell you, well, what we need to do is just develop products that are higher on the value chain, right? That like whatever primary products we produce, we shouldn't just ship it out. We ourselves, as the Guyanese nation, should use these raw materials to create refined commodities. And the question then becomes, well, where do you get the capital to do it? And this is where the underdevelopment really comes in, because to get the capital, you have to reach out to the Import-Export Bank of China, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which are all predatory institutions. The institutions are so predatory that at this current moment, Guyana pays about 40-something% of its gross domestic product, its GDP, towards just handling its external debt. So then the people of Guyana are choked by this international finance agreement, because when they rise up, when the sugar workers rise up, for example, and say, well, you've laid us off, you've closed down these sugar estates as you claim they're not competitive, where's our severance pay? And really and truly, the severance pay is going to the international organizations that are squeezing Guyana. And a revolutionary would say, cancel the debt, right? Repudiate the debt. We're not paying down this debt, it's predatory. Whereas the government not only pays the debt, but enters into austerity agreements where it tries to cut back on pensions, wages, healthcare, denationalizes and privatizes as a result to show to their foreign lenders that they're fiscally responsible. Now, within Guyana, the dynamics of class and race kind of dictate how this happens. So one good example is, again, to go back to the sugar workers. So for those who did the reading, you would understand. For those who didn't, here's a summary. As Guyana developed in the 19th century, as the abolition of slavery was won in the 1930s, there became a crisis of what labor will replace the Africans on the plantations. And one of the things they did is they tried to bring in Black indentured servants and workers from the other islands where slavery had been abolished. They tried to bring in the Portuguese from Madeira. They brought in people from China as well, which is why Guyana actually has both a minority Portuguese and Chinese population. But really and truly, they struck gold when they decided on a scheme of Indian indentureship. And this scheme lasted all the way until 1917, actually, when Gandhi and other Indian nationalists started fighting against it. But what it did was created this juxtaposition and this fight for jobs and resources between Guyanese of African descent and Guyanese of Indian descent. And to this day, this conflict continues, but it has continued in a transformed way insofar as these laborers themselves became transformed. So after slavery, for example, freed Africans would go to the plantations and speak with the plantation owners, and as workers, negotiate wages for the day as gangs of workers. this contrasted very much because these Africans themselves pulled money together. They bought up old plantations and they created villages. And there's a whole Guyanese African village movement you can go into. But just there's a juxtaposition of the Africans living in their free villages that they bought and built, and then the Indians as indentured laborers living on the plantation, seeing these gangs of black workers coming to the plantations to negotiate the wages, acting as competition. And then there began to develop a racial animosity between the two. And the racial animosity was stoked by the British ruling class. So I'm going to try to find a quick quote to read in regards to this. And it was in our reading. So this is from one of the governors during the upheaval in Guyana in 1848. One of the planters, rather. He stated the presence of a few Africans, coolies, which is a derogatory term for people from Asia, and one used very popularly in Guyana for Indo-Guyanese people. The presence of a few Africans, coolies, Portuguese, have on the occasion of this strike proved the salvation of the colony. I think entirely the planters themselves attribute the preservation of their lives to it. From one of the letters, it's clear that the different races in this colony is one of the great cause of confidence they feel in their personal safety. They look upon the Portuguese and coolies as their friend in any struggle which might take place. So there we see that not only is there a natural and material development of this racial animosity, there's an exploitation of it by the ruling class. So then as we move forward to the period where Africans are off the plantation, indentured laborers remain in rural areas but are no longer tied to the plantation through a contract of bondage. And we enter a period in the early 20th century where labor struggles start to erupt as workers both on plantations and on the docks, public servants are fighting not just for rights as workers, but fighting against the British for more home rule, for the right to vote, and these types of things. The British again try to use this animosity between Africans and Indians. And no one has spoken best as to the dynamics of this than the Guyanese revolutionary Walter Rodney. So now to kind of pivot to that, I ask Ale to just play us a short clip from a documentary with Walter Rodney. It's just going to be about 30 seconds or so. That's it. Out. Yeah. So there, Walter Rodney is basically saying no one but the working class can liberate the working class, right? If somebody's giving you freedom as a gift, they're fooling you or they're fooling themselves. And this is very important for understanding the context of Guyana's anti-colonial struggle, because Guyana's anti-colonial struggle picked up steam in the period after World War II, in the same way the civil rights movement in the United States picked up steam after World War II. And one of the factors was the return of the veterans from these wars, right? Who have been trained in these tactics of combat, who've had a worldly view to understand their place in the world. And as this happens, one of the things that happens in Guyana is that the racial divide begins to be bridged. Sugar workers, who are predominantly Indo-Guyanese, and bauxite workers, who are predominantly Afro-Guyanese, start staging marches together for independence. And one of the political parties that comes out of this is the People's Progressive Party, which is headed by Chedi Jagan, who's a very famous Guyanese socialist and communist. And Chedi Jagan himself comes from a rural East Indian village, and he's able, when he comes back from his studies in England, to build a base amongst these sugar workers. Someone else comes back from England as well, and this guy's name is Forbes Burnham. I'm sorry, Chedi Jagan actually studied dentistry in the United States, not in England. But Forbes Burnham comes back from England as a trained lawyer. He's a great orator. He's a very charming person. And Forbes Burnham and Chedi Jagan formed this mutual party called the People's Progressive Party that launched a radical challenge against British colonialism. They win universal suffrage. And in the first election, they win, right? They say, we need to take power now. But instead of taking power, the British sent a military occupation into Guyana. And under the pressure of this military occupation, there began to be a split within the People's Progressive Party along racial lines. Again, this same antagonism, right, between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. And eventually, Forbes Burnham would leave the People's Progressive Party to found something called the People's National Congress. And in this fight for independence, both the British and the US were scared of what happened in Cuba. They explicitly say in their internal documents, which are now available, we do not want another Cuba. So they manipulate the electoral process so that the People's National Congress becomes the first party that comes to power in Guyana. And if you say that, you know, the People's National Congress, popularly referred to as the PNC, if you talk about this party and the international scheme, people think, oh yes, Forbes Burnham, that great socialist, that great revolutionary. But the reality is Forbes Burnham came to power in Guyana with the assistance of Scotland Yard, the CIA, and Guyana's local business interests. And when I say Guyana's local business interests, I don't mean in an informal way. They had a party called the United Force that was consisted of a lot of Portuguese and Chinese Guyanese who had business interests, and they, together with Burnham, formed a government. However, the People's Progressive Party wasn't going anywhere, right? It was there, it was the opposition, and because they based themselves primarily, not exclusively, but primarily amongst the Indo-Guyanese population, and the Indo-Guyanese population in Guyana is a plurality of the population, it's always the case that should you just appeal to race-based voting, that the People's Progressive Party technically should win. That technicality was solved by this system of proportional representation they put in, which allowed the PNC to unite with the United Force. However, the honeymoon between the United Force and the PNC did not last long. In the 1970s, Forbes Burnham decided that he was going to tack left, right? That in this Cold War period, he was going to rely less on the United States and move more towards the USSR. And this experimentation was codified in Guyana in a 1980 constitution that said Guyana is a cooperative socialist republic. And that is still our constitution to this day, which is quite remarkable. So as Guyana tries to relate to the world, it relates. And if you, for example, continue watching that documentary we played a clip from, you will see the government sponsors protests where people with banners go out and say, down with imperialism, right? Like, and this is the reputation of the government. But internally, this same government was repressing dissidents. And this same government would eventually, on June 13, 1980, murder Walter Rodney. And part of it has to do with what Rodney was pointing out, because Rodney, insofar as he was a Marxist, really and truly believed in the ruthless criticism of everything, but this wasn't paper criticism. It was a criticism that haunted Rodney throughout his life. This is a Rodney tangent, people. So when Rodney, for example, studied in Tanzania, right, during the period of Ujamaa socialism brought in by Julius Nyerere, Rodney wrote critiques of that process, to which Nyerere wrote a blistering response in the nationalist newspaper. And eventually, Rodney left Tanzania and he went to teach at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. So if you've ever heard about the book Groundings with My Brothers, this is the period it refers to where Rodney is not only a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, but when he's done lecturing, he leaves the university and he goes into the ghettos. He sits down with Rastafarians and regular working class people. He teaches them Black history. He listens to them and he learns from them. And they build a Black power movement that threatens the government so much that when Rodney in 1968 travels to Montreal for the Black Writers Conference, the government quickly makes him persona non grata and say, you cannot return to this country. And in response, students who are graduating that year use their graduation as a way to protest Rodney's exclusion from the country. And they held a march. But as they, in their caps and gowns, held this march, what they did was go into the community, and the community responded in an organic fashion, similar to what we're seeing now in the United States with the George Floyd rebellions, by starting what is now popularly known as the Rodney riots. And this movement would spread throughout the Caribbean as people petitioned for the Jamaican government to let Rodney back in. So, you know, at the time, Jamaica was ruled by Shearer, who was a very conservative, anti-Black politician. So Rodney had to, in many ways, run from Jamaica. And he went back to Tanzania for a time. But eventually, Rodney would return to Guyana because, as stated in Claremont Chong's documentary, Rodney felt like he needed to, quote unquote, speak the idiom of the people, right, to be able to really ground himself in a revolution. So upon Rodney's return in the 1970s, he was supposed to start working at the University of Guyana, and he was unable to do so because Forbes Burnham said, no, this is a dangerous person, you can't have this appointment. So Rodney goes back to Guyana, he helps to form what's called the Working People's Alliance. They agitate for change, they analyze, they have these street corner meetings, but most importantly, they say, right, and this is to paraphrase Rodney, that the principal task of the generation of Guyanese revolutionaries, leftists, and socialists is to break the divide within the working class through achieving a struggle based on unity, and not appeals to unity in an airy theoretical sense, but to say that people in their workplaces, people in their homes, people as they practice culture should find common ground and struggle against this main enemy. So when you ask people about Guyana, for example, they'll say, well, what about Jim Jones? And the reality is, as you grow up in Guyana, you learn nothing about Jim Jones. It's hard to even fathom what it was. But Jim Jones is very much related to Guyana's socialist period, because Guyana was a socialism of poverty in many ways, right? Like, we didn't have a wealth to redistribute. We redistributed poverty. So as a result, we had this, and continue to have, a fascination with foreigners. And one of these foreigners was Jim Jones, who approached the Guyanese government. He was like, yeah, I want to come in, I'm going to do this. So Jim Jones murders hundreds of people in the Guyanese rainforest. They even murder a US congressman, which is really what puts it on the map. And the Guyanese government is left flat-footed as a socialist government, because at the end of the day, it was still doing as its main economic activity what Guyana was doing in the 19th century when it was British Guyana. It was exporting raw materials for the international market. And as these commodity prices rise and fall, so too does the Guyanese economy. And as the patron of socialist Guyana, the USSR goes through its own economic, social, and political crisis and implodes in the late 80s and early 90s, so too there becomes a reckoning in Guyana, where this government that stays in power from 1966 to 1992 using electoral fraud can no longer hold on to power. It must now enter into relationships with the imperialism, open relationships. So in 1992, Jimmy Carter, former US president of the Carter Center, comes in to oversee Guyana's what's referred to as our first free and fair elections. And I remember, if race-based voting and politics is the thing, the People's Progressive Party must inevitably win. And the People's Progressive Party won from 1992 to 2015. That is the government that was in charge of Guyana. During that period, Cheddi Jagan assumes the presidency in 92. He dies around 1997. And there's, again, the racial conundrum, right? Because they're smart enough to bring in a black prime minister. So the prime minister under Cheddi Jagan was this guy named Samuel Hines. But, you know, when the president dies, who takes office? The prime minister does. But in the next election, they don't run the prime minister as the candidate. They actually run Cheddi Jagan's wife. And I don't know if people know who Cheddi Jagan's wife is. But Cheddi Jagan's wife is Janet Jagan, who was a white Jewish American woman who in many ways, you know, sincerely dedicated herself to the struggle for democracy and making Guyana a better place. But look at the optics of it, right? That in this country of where there's a large black population, there's a large Indo-Guyanese population, there's smatterings of Portuguese and Chinese, and a not insignificant indigenous population. The president becomes a white woman from America, and it becomes a very untenable presidency. Like I remember when I was in high school, there were like, well, in Guyana we would call them Obia women, right? In the rest of the world they call it voodoo, or you know, witches. They went outside the office of the president while Janet Jagan, soon after Janet Jagan was recently elected, and they had a chant, and it went like this. It said, "We ain't giving up. We're gonna walk punchy. We ain't giving up. We're gonna walk punchy." And it's basically a commitment to saying this struggle doesn't stop until this woman comes out of office. And she does eventually demit office, but then we get the rise of what I would refer to today as Guyana's Trump. This guy named Barrett Jagdeo, and Barrett Jagdeo comes to power, and he's like a Russian-trained economist. He was the finance minister for a while. He was a very young person when he assumed office, very charismatic. And he leads Guyana into this period where, again, we continue to sell primary products on the international market. So we're, for the most part, economically stagnated. And cables from the US Embassy, subsequent investigations, and many things revealed that Jagdeo took Guyana into becoming a narco state, where there was such a violence present in the society, massacre after massacre, predominantly against Afro-Guyanese people, complemented with attacks against Indo-Guyanese as well, especially those who owned businesses, that Guyana became a chaotic place to live. And the general emigration that happens took up an extra pace. And people like myself, right? So like when I left Guyana in 2002, I was 16 going on 17. And the reason my mother gave for us leaving is, as a young black man in this country, I don't feel safe. The irony of me living in the United States now under the George Floyd rebellion is not lost. So in 2015, there was another election held, and a coalition was formed between the People's National Congress, the remnants of Walter Rodney's Working People's Alliance, and the Alliance for Change, which originated as a dissident group that broke away from the People's Progressive Party. And they achieved this amazing task of unseating the People's Progressive Party from power. They had a campaign that I would say might be analogous to Barack Obama's campaign insofar as it gave people a real sense that should this government come to power, we will see a new day, that we will see not just changes in the way the world works generally, but materially. And I like to share this example because one of the things that happened when this government first came to power is that people cleaned up the city of Georgetown, right? So because Georgetown has been predominantly an Afro-Guyanese city, it's been led, its city council, by the People's National Congress. And because of the conflict between this local People's National Congress and the National People's Progressive Party, a lot of municipal services went to waste. And Georgetown, which was previously known as the Garden City, got the nickname of the Garbage City because there was just garbage everywhere. So people were so inspired by this government coming to power, they went and they cleaned up themselves, right? Like Some people put on gloves, not everyone. They went in, they cleaned the canals, they took all the trash out. So my cousin tells me this story. She said, you know, before this government came, there was this tree on the Avenue of the Republic, and it was always like a barren tree. And when this government came into power, the tree started to bloom. And I take that story to say that there was like such deep, what's the word? There's really a deep feeling within people that things would change. However, when this government came to power, it kind of just started off on the wrong foot. For one thing, it gave 50% pay raises to all the government ministers, which is significant because one of their campaign promises was significant wage increases for public sector workers. And okay, so they give themselves these big raises, but first they lie about it, right? They say, no, we didn't do that. Well, someone goes and finds the official gazette from Parliament and say, here, you did it. Here's the proof. And they're like, yeah, we did it, but here's why. We did it to fight corruption, because if these ministers are this well paid, they won't have to go out and seek bribes from the business community. And if you're a smart person, you know this is bullshit, right? And Guyanese people knew this was bullshit, but the alternative of the People's Progressive Party is not something a lot of people wanted. Because we just came from Guyana being dominated as a narco state. People weren't safe. Okay, but then the government's missteps continue. For example, they promised the teachers significant public sector increases, and when the teacher said, all right, where's that money? The president, David Granger, who's a retired military general and a very charismatic man, said, teachers, don't worry, I got this. I'm going to form a commission of inquiry into your wages, and we'll take it from there. And the commission of inquiry comes back and incredibly says the teachers deserve a 40% wage increase. And you would say, okay, if the government ministers get 50%, why can't these hardworking teachers who mold the nation's youth get 40%? The government wouldn't budge. And the teachers went on strike, and the teachers, predominantly Afro-Guyanese, I would say it's like a 60-40 split between Afro-Guyanese teachers and Indo-Guyanese teachers, went on strike against a government they helped put into office, which is very significant, right? But like part of the problem is the racial animosity again left the struggles apart. The sugar workers were striking too. The sugar workers were striking to say, stop closing the plantations, and for where you have closed it, give us severance pay. And yet there was no linkage between these two struggles. And this teacher strike happened in 2018, and then in December of 2018, one of the most dramatic periods in Guyanese history started when this guy named Charandas Basad, who was from the aforementioned Alliance for Change, he's part of the government coalition. Well, let me back up. So this government came to power, right, with making a lot of promises. One of the promises it followed through on was holding local government elections, like, you know, municipal and regional elections. And in these elections, they actually suffered huge setbacks. In the most recent election, prior to December 2018, the coalition was in such a disarray that the Alliance for Change ran separately from the coalition. And I don't know that the government could not see the writing on the wall, but what it turns out is that the People's Progressive Party recruited someone from the Alliance for Change to their side and launched a no confidence motion against the government in Parliament. And the government actually had the votes in place to defeat this motion. So as the votes are being called, you know, they're going, oh, well, Miss Alejandra, how do you vote? And they go, no. Mara, how do you vote? No. They come to Charandas Prasad, they say, Mr. Charandas. And Charandas takes a big gulp of water and he goes, yes. And the whole chamber erupts. Like, I'm trying to find the video to show for us to watch. The whole chambers erupt with everyone screaming, Charandas, say no, say no, what's wrong with you? The dude next to him slaps him on the arm. And he says to the shocked body, it's a conscience thing. It's a conscious thing. So, you know, pictures speak 1,000 words. I'm going to send this over to Ali. Ali, if you can play it for us, please. The vote heard around the country is what I like to call it. So like we can like when I talk to Guyanese people, I ask them, where were you when this vote happened? And they can tell you like precisely. Like, I was at the fish shop, I was eating, I was in my house.
Robert, it's 6 minutes. Which part should I play?
From the beginning.
Okay.
Yes. Mr. Lumumba. Aye. Mistress Pauline Sukai.
Yes.
Dr. Anthony.
Yes.
Miss Mani Chand.
Yes.
Mr. Nanlal.
Yes.
Mr. Ali.
Yes.
Mr. Shira.
Yes.
Mr. Rohi.
Yes.
Mr. Jagdeo.
Yes.
Mr. Rutherford.
No.
Mr. Rajkumar.
No.
Mr. C. Prasad.
Yes.
Mr. Tavira.
No. 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 Correct yourself. Correct it. No. No. Correct it now. No. No.
Mr. C. Prasad.
No.
Mr. C. Prasad.
No.
Yes.
No.
Mr. Chardas Prasad.
No.
Chardas?
Yeah, that's enough, Ali. Yeah, so I just want to give people a sense of the confusion this caused, right? But like, so here's the thing: the same night, this man gets spirited away out the country through the Canadian High Commission, and has been living in Canada ever since. So, when a no confidence motion is passed against you, you pretty much have a short time frame to call a snap election. This government did not do that. It appealed and appealed and appealed. First, they appealed and they said, well, can Charandas Prasad vote? It turns out he's a dual citizen of another country. And our constitution says you cannot be a parliamentarian if you're a dual citizen. Well, whoever unearthed that stone, turns out there's dual citizens in both parties serving as parliamentarians. So that tack didn't work. And then there became this strange math. And the math was this. Well, what is a majority of the 65 members of parliament? And they went into this huge court debate about it. But eventually, they appealed to the Caribbean Court of Justice, and the Caribbean Court of Justice says the no confidence motion stands. But by the time the appeals were all done, and the fighting with the Guyana Electoral Commission was done, the elections weren't held until March of this year. And the results of those elections are still, for the most part, in dispute. But again, there is no way you can do race-based voting and the People's Progressive Party doesn't win. So if you were watching that video and they said, Mr. Ali, that Irfan Ali guy, Mr. Irfan Ali actually is now poised to become the president of Guyana, a man who, for all intents and purposes, forged his academic credentials. No one can tell where this mysterious college he went to is. And a man who is seen as a puppet of the leader of the opposition, Barrett Jagdeo. So I know this talk was supposed to be about the place of Guyana in the world, but I gave the presentation the way I did because I do not feel you can understand Guyana's place in the world without understanding the internal political, class, and racial developments in Guyana. And I think it's a mistake a lot of leftists make right? When they try to understand the world, a lot of leftists in the US and in the West, by looking at the world through their own lens, that they don't investigate the dynamics within these countries as they exist. So I'm not going to go on for much longer, except to say that there's a new period and a new intensified fight in Guyana for class power between the two wings of the petty bourgeoisie who array themselves along the lines of race, because there was an oil find off the shore of Guyana, which Exxon is supposed to be getting ready to produce. But I would come back again to the concept of primary products on an international market. Not only is Guyana technologically unable to draw the oil itself or refine the oil, but it's getting back into the habit of basing its economy on a primary product, this time oil, subject to the rise and fall of commodity prices. And what better example of a fall than what's happened to oil prices under COVID-19, to the point where they don't even have places to store oil that they're extracting. And this seems to in no way factor into the analysis of either the government or the opposition in Guyana. The fact that Guyana's coastline lies below sea level, right? And that we face constant floods because the irrigation system we have is pretty much the irrigation system that the Dutch built when they came to Guyana. When I say the Dutch built, I mean they had slaves do it. They don't think about the prospects of environmental disaster, for example, right? Should an oil spill happen, it would be catastrophic, not just for Guyana's biodiversity and wildlife, but for the people who live in Guyana, because we know when it rains a little too hard in Guyana, our yards and roads get flooded. And just imagine if that flooding happened with oiled water. What mechanisms does the Guyanese government have to fight against this? None. What mechanisms does the Guyanese government have to hold Exxon accountable? None. If you read a New York Times piece about the coming oil boom, it makes clear that the Guyana's Geology and Mines Department, which is supposed to oversee Exxon, is staffed by about like 10 to 20 people, whereas Exxon itself has an operating yearly budget many times over of even Guyana's GDP. But the international finance corporations like the IMF and so on are pleased by this oil development because they say, oh, finally Guyana can start paying down its debts. But if any government in Guyana actually begins to care about its people, if it wants to stop the hemorrhaging of Guyanese people who are just leaving the country, they would be putting forward, based on these oil profits, a major public works program, because Guyana has an insufficient electricity grid. Guyana has an insufficient road infrastructure. Guyana has a grand total of maybe 3 bridges over its many waters, which is ironic for a country that builds itself as the land of many waters. I myself am from a place in Guyana called Bartica. Bartica sits at the isthmus of the Essequibo River, where it turns into the Mazaruni River on one side and the Cayuni River on one side. But it is not an island yet. When I go to Guyana, if I want to visit Bartica, because of our poor infrastructure, the best way for me to get there is to take a bus over the Demerara River, which is bridged, drive all the way over to the Essequibo River, and then take a boat. Why? Because the roads simply have not been built. Because infrastructure in Guyana has historically been built around the plantation economy. And as we became an independent nation, we did not have capital to build elsewhere, nor did we have the political will, because the people in power were not serving in the interest of Guyana's working masses. Our country is best seen as a peripheral country insofar as we have not just mass unemployment, but we have like people responding to the mass unemployment by creating a huge informal economy of vendors, for example, right, who just resell different items that they themselves buy or they have relatives and friends shipped from the US. So Guyana is poised to join and break out of the periphery, but the question is, how does it do so? and avoid the notorious Dutch disease of what happens when oil wealth comes to developing nations. And the solution, I would say, has to come from Guyanese people acting in concert with each other, consciously recognizing that race in Guyana is a tool being used by the petty bourgeoisie to mask capital accumulation. Even Guyana's socialist period was about this. It was about the fact that Guyana's ruling class, right? And you talk about Guyana's ruling class, you cannot call it a bourgeoisie because the bourgeoisie is supposed to be a possessing class. And as Walter Rodney points out, Guyana's ruling class was a possessing class, and the neo-colonial ruling classes in the Caribbean in general are possessing classes that possess very little. So how do you build up and shelter a developing bourgeoisie? Well, you have the state take over parts of the economy. But as we know, state control of the economy under capitalism is something that's very dangerous because, for one thing, it houses everything under one roof, and it's very easy to workers to fight against it. But the other thing is that it suppresses competition between firms and makes capitalism unflexible, and it makes capitalism unable to wipe out the waste capital it would usually do in competitions between firms. This is my state capitalist analysis of the USSR coming in. But it was untenable, right? So as they began to shed the nationalization of sugar, the nationalization of bauxite, the nationalization of electricity, all of these things have been meaningfully reversed in Guyana, both under the Black and the Indian governments. They were then able to form more and more of a possessing class, and it's a general consensus in Guyana that this possessing class is predominantly Indo-Guyanese, whereas Afro-Guyanese have disproportionate influence and representation in the state and in the government. But really what it is, it's that it's always been a twin association between the Indo-Guyanese business community and the Afro-Guyanese state power. And in the period when the People's Progressive Party was in power, you had the Indo-Guyanese business community and the state, where there was wrestling for power within it between the People's Progressive Party and bureaucrats and functionaries within the armed parts, the army and the police, who were Afro-Guyanese. So the solution has to come from the bottom up, but the real solution has been buried because the legacy of Walter Rodney is buried in Guyana. And as we begin to explore more and more his legacy and his methodology of grounding with each other, that's the basis we have for real change. And I'll end there.